He had children with his own mother in an Appalachian hollow, a lineage that outlasted oversight. It was late autumn of 2009 in the Dry Fork stretch above Keystone, where the first frost hangs in Laurel, and a single mailbox serves 3 trails. A cinder-block house sits behind a washed-out switchback, its windows veiled in plastic, its driveway ending in mud that keeps secrets. Inside are Amos Calder, late 30s, his mother, Ruth Calder, mid-50s, 2 children marked as siblings in a 2007 register, and an anonymous tip that begins as a routine welfare check. What precisely did the records know, and when did they learn it? Before we dive in, if you value careful, original investigations like this one, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next chapter. The call comes on a gray morning when the first fog does not lift. A county librarian named Lena Weathers, tasked with supporting public record retrieval after a spring flood, is seconded to help Child Services find archival paperwork that a field team cannot locate on site. The household in question sits beyond the municipal map. The road quits at a culvert half buried in shale. From there, a footpath pushes into rhododendron. The house registers on no current parcel overlay. The mailbox bears a name that does not match the tax roll. The structure is a cinder-block rectangle with a piecemeal roof of reclaimed tin. A diesel generator sits silent, vent pipe blackened. Milk crates carve a walkway over mud. The smell of kerosene and cold ash lingers at the door. There is one satellite dish, pointed at nothing, and a hand-painted sign that reads Private Road, but there is no road. A spring box downhill is capped in plywood. The terrain and the choices it invited are the first barrier. On a shelf by a cast-iron stove, a framed photograph shows a woman in a thrifted white gown and a man in a black shirt with pearl snaps. The frame is cheap gilt. The glass holds a hairline crack. The pose is standard, shoulder to shoulder, hands folded. The date, scrawled in silver ink along the mat, reads late summer of 2004, written in careful hand. The faces repeat a pattern seen on cousins and aunts in the valleys: pale hair against dark pine, a wide nasal bridge, a narrow philtrum. The resemblance edges past ordinary kinship. The names match the mailbox. At the library 2 towns away, Lena pulls a ledger that should live in vital statistics but is here, damp along the spine. The entries are for home births attended by lay midwives and routed through a clinic that lost accreditation in the mid-2000s. 2 children carry the surname Calder. Mother, Ruth Calder. Father, Amos Calder. The ages push probability beyond discomfort. The same names appear in a school enrollment ledger 3 winters later, guardian of record shifts between mother and son across forms. Each line carries the same faint pencil tick beside the household address. Unverified. Location. How did a son sleep with his own mother and father children with her without triggering the redundant alarms designed to trip in school, clinic, and court? And who bent the paperwork so a family tree became a circle? Lena learns to read repetition as signal. The same church name appears and disappears across records. The same 2 witnesses sign 3 separate events. A pediatric intake notes familial features suggestive of autosomal recessive trait. Recommend genetics, then the referral vanishes from the electronic trail. A tax assessor's margin note from 2006 states, homestead granted, upon sworn testimony of dependents. File lacks corroborating IDs. The shape of the data hardens into a motif. Everything is almost in order. The incident that put shoe leather on the trail is prosaic. A welfare check, prompted by an anonymous letter left under a church door, climbs the ridge with a deputy and a caseworker. They find the children warm, fed, homeschooled, and shy. They also find a waterlogged tin that once held crackers. Inside, copies of birth certificates with the same two names in the parent fields, and a purchase receipt for a second-hand generator from late summer of 2007, paid in cash. The caseworker notes the certificates as irregular but present. The deputy calls them good enough. Lena, asked to authenticate, calls them something else, a hinge. When Lena requests the original birth filings to cross-check ink, the county clerk smiles the way office holders do when a file is a problem. The clerk says the archive was damaged in the flood. The clerk says the clinic closed and its boxes are sealed by court order. The clerk says Child Services can do what it wants, but the vital records vault answers to the state. Lena leaves with nothing but a damp copy and a sense that the building itself has learned to say no. In a notebook, Lena sketches a kinship map, thin and tentative. The Calder line lives in 3 dwellings within a mile and a half: the cinder block house, a trailer higher on the switchback, and a cabin across a creek that freezes early. Over 5 decades, the surnames converge through first cousins and second cousins. She gives the system a name to hold it in her mind: the Ridge Compact. It is not written anywhere that she can find, but every trace suggests an internal order with rules, seasons, and roles. Locals call it the milk house, though it is not a dairy. A stone, shed with a tin door, sits near the spring box, lichen thick on the north face. Inside, shelving holds mason jars, lamp oil, and a crate of school books stamped property of district. A mattress lies rolled under a table. The structure feels like a spillover room for seasons when the main house cannot hold everything or everyone. A set of short hash marks stained into the door jamb begins low and rises unevenly. They stop at 3 feet, then start again, as if 2 histories had been kept on the same wood. Distance converts into delay. A half-mile here is not the half-mile of a city grid. Each visit requires planning around weather, fuel, and whether the creek will rise. The Ridge trains institutions to relent. The sheriff respects property lines that do not exist on maps. Teachers accept homeschooling declarations that arrive on notebook paper. Clinics bill a post office box. The absence of ordinary friction gives the compact room to harden. Lena's inquiry slides between desks. Child Services says it saw healthy children and notes no immediate hazard. Schools cite a valid homeschool filing. The health department files a no-contact note after a missed genetics referral. The State Vital Records Office flags the duplicate parent names but returns the query stamped insufficient cause. Each office sees a sliver. No one holds the whole. The compact seems to know this and writes its life in gaps. Weeks later, during a flood debris survey, a road crew clears a blown culvert and pulls up a wooden box with a rusted lock that surrenders to a pry bar. Inside is a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The handwriting is neat, the paper foxed. The pages are divided by seasons. Along the margin sit small shapes: triangles, circles, squares, some doubled, some hollow. Names appear beside the shapes, not quite initials. The entries read like household inventories, but patterns in the seasons carry an implication that jars. The same 2 signifiers appear across multiple winters next to 2 names Lena already knows. Lena catalogs the sigils as if they were a second language. Triangles in winter cluster near the cinder block address. Circles in summer move uphill to the trailer. Squares in spring drop across the creek to the cabin. Every 3rd winter, a double triangle sits by the main house with a mark that could be a star or a flower. In the margins, jars of peaches, gallons of lamp oil. School books moved, blankets mended, seed saved. Domestic life accounted for with care and, perhaps, a rotation nobody admits aloud. At the county library, Lena cross-references the ledger names with deed traces and old church bulletins scanned after a consolidation drive the previous decade. The names recur in schedules for seasonal work crews and in a shuttered church's potluck tallies. A newsletter lists an anniversary for a couple who never filed a marriage. A lost ledger found just enough to suggest more remains missing. The compact, if that is what it is, keeps its own time. The story risks collapse into spectacle. Lena's notes insist on neutral phrasing, clinical where necessary, human where possible. She writes Ruth Calder, not the mother. She writes Amos Calder, not the son, when lineage matters less than agency. She abstracts the children into initials on the page to keep them out of the churn. The question is not who to shame, but how a net with layers. School, clinic, clerk, let a lineage fold inward until a son fathered children with his own mother without the alerts firing. A rumor surfaces that a box with clinic logs from the mid-2000s sits in a basement room under the courthouse annex, sealed during a malpractice suit that never made it to trial. The rumor says the box holds misfiled birth registers, reel-to-reel dictation from prenatal visits, and a stack of referral slips bound with twine. The rumor also says the box cannot be opened without a judge's note. Lena writes the rumor down because rumors are where formal records start. By early winter, Lena's notebook holds a pattern that cannot be shrugged off. The Ridge Compact appears to have its own rules for pairing, seasonal movements, and paperwork that puts siblings where children should be, and children where nephews could be. A son sleeps with his own mother and becomes both father and brother. The records seem to know and not know this at the same time. Terrain, habit, and institutional tiredness conspire to keep the circle closed. The question that remains as the first snow dusts the laurel is not whether this happened, but how to pry the archive open without breaking the people it contains. A storm is forecast to stall over the range, bringing the kind of rain that moves hillsides. If the culverts blow again, more boxes may surface from places where the compact hid them. Lena files a formal request to the State Archive for any sealed clinic material tied to the valley, and a reporter from a regional paper, working a separate story on flood spending, files a records request of her own. Two thin threads pull at the same knot. The next act begins with water. Rain arrives like a sustained argument. The culvert below the cinder block house fails again, and the road crew returns, not to clear passage but to save the slope from sliding. Brown water tears through the ditch and carries small things first: a child's workbook, a glass jar with a rusty lid, a corn broom, a rectangle of oilcloth. When the current settles, what remains is not debris, but documents that someone intended to keep close. Lena notes the timing in her log: late winter, the ridge newly saturated, the archive loosened by water rather than permission. The oilcloth holds a second ledger, the twin of the book lifted weeks before, with the same steady hand and the same seasonal divisions. The first pages list inventories and repairs. Deeper in, the entries tilt domestic toward deliberate. Notations appear beside names that are now familiar: the woman who is both mother and grandmother to the youngest, the man who is both son and father. The symbols repeat in cycles of 3 winters, as if the compact keeps time in winters rather than years. Asterisks bloom beside the main house in years when the triangle reappears. There are no sentences to translate intent, only marks and intervals to infer it. Lena copies shapes into her notebook, not trusting the wet paper to hold. To understand the system beyond instinct, the investigation pulls backward across kin. 3 generations fit on 1 legal pad, 6 required taping sheets into a map that covers a library table. At the top, 2 surnames from neighboring hollows marry and remarry until the names themselves thin, and the first names carry more weight than the last. Cousins join cousins. A second marriage follows a funeral. Households collapse into each other when roofs give way or a truck stops running. The compact looks less like a tree and more like 3 loops linked at one point. Date estimates creep along the margins. A birth in the late 1970s. Another in the early 1980s when the sawmill still cut steady. A quiet cluster in the early 2000s after the mill closed and the migration to town failed to take. In all of it, the same domestic geography repeats. Main house, trailer, creek cabin, milk house. The ledger entries begin to read as a schedule as much as a diary. Blankets move downhill at first snow. Lamps are filled on the first dark of December. Canned peaches are opened in late January when the path ices. In years when the double triangle sits beside the main house, school books migrate to the milk house, and a note appears about a midwife staying for 2 nights. The repetition is too regular to be coincidence. In the same years, the misfiled birth registry shows an infant attributed to the same 2 names. The ledger never writes the act, but the timing is a scaffold. Water forces more than books to the surface. At the base of the ridge, a slope, sloughed by the storm shears clean, and reveals stones aligned too neatly to be chance. They stand shorter than a knee and wear no carvings, but their placement reads intentional. 3 across and 2 down, a small grid. The smell is loam and old leaves, not decay. Whatever lies below is years old, and likely more mundane than the worst imagination wants. Lena measures with a taupe. 3 across measures roughly 6 feet, 2 down measures roughly 4 feet. The dates that make sense with those measurements are not hard to approximate. In a pocket notebook, she writes a single word for herself: burials. She records count and grid and location. She does not speculate causes. The compact knew where to keep quiet, and the hillside, this season, did not. Institutional attention heats and keeps slipping away. The sheriff takes photographs and files an incident note that uses terms like historical and family plot. Child Services says the children in the main house appear stable and supervised. The health department emails that genetics referrals are recommendations, not mandates. The State Vital Records Office responds to a second request with a template that cites limited staff and ambiguous authority. Jurisdiction shifts the way water finds the easiest channel. Everyone sees one facet and no one chooses to hold the whole, because holding the whole would demand action that is hard to fund and harder to sustain. A separate thread pulls taut from a different direction. The regional reporter who filed records requests for flood spending receives, by way of an overly broad response, a stack of clinic correspondence that should have been redacted. Among the photocopies sits a memorandum from the mid-2000s written by a supervising physician who flagged a run of home births with the same 2 adult names listed in both parental fields. The memo uses cautious language about consanguinity and recommends converting paper charts to electronic records to improve cross-flagging. The clinic closed before the conversion. The memo traveled into a box, then into an archive room, then onto a copy machine that did not recognize which pages should be gray. The reporter shares the memo with the librarian. For the first time, an institutional voice on paper says the quiet concern out loud, even if no one will speak it now. What to call the mechanism matters. Lena keeps Ridge compact in her notes. It feels like the right size. Not a cult, not a sect, not even a plan. More like a set of habits hardened into a pattern by terrain, poverty, and the human tendency to solve a problem with whatever is already at hand. But patterns can be intentional and can be constrained. The ledger's symbols do not happen by accident, nor do the seasonal moves of household goods and children. The geography of oversight against the geography of secrecy yields measurable distances. From the main house to the school district office is 12 road miles. To the clinic site is 8 if the bridge is passable. To the courthouse vault is 14. And to the State Vital Records office is 70. From the front door to the milk house is 50 paces. From the back step to the slope where the stones stand is within sight of the kitchen window. The closer the risk of discovery, the tighter the circle closes. A homeschool letter folded into a church bulletin requires a short walk. A trip to town invites questions and the chance of a clerk who stays late. Stakes rise on paper before they rise in the rooms where decisions are made. The 2 children in the file marked with initials age into school years where socialization gaps show. A pediatric intake from the winter after the storm lists a height percentile and a note about speech that trails off in a template box. A teacher in a consolidation school marks absences that line up with the seasons when the ledger shows the milk house holding school books. None of this is catastrophic. Much of it is survivable. All of it is preventable in a county with services that reach farther and laws that require fewer voluntaries. The lore of the compact extends backward into a kind of origin story, not for drama, but for context. Old bulletins mention a mine strike in the late 1970s that frayed kin networks. A road closure in the early 1980s stranded a handful of families through one winter. A church split removed the nearest moral gate in the early 2000s. Around each event, loops in the genealogy tighten when outer worlds fall away. Inner worlds reinforce themselves. If the only reliable man in reach is a cousin, then a cousin can become a husband. If the only reliable house is the one with the generator, then the house with the generator becomes the center. Once an arrangement like a double triangle copies itself into multiple winters, it becomes almost ordinary to the people inside it. Pressure finally builds where water and paper meet. The partial declassification of the clinic memo prompts the state attorney general's archivist to call the county, which prompts the clerk to admit that a sealed box exists in the annex basement. The box contains reel-to-reel tapes labeled by week and season from the clinic's final 2 years, plus a stack of misfiled birth registers that never traveled up the chain because the clinic closed mid-transfer. None of this is admissible without process, but it is enough to compel a judge to sign a narrow order to inventory contents under supervision. The sound of the tapes matters less than their existence. The paper registers, however, hold ink and dates that match the ledger's marks. In one register, the parental lines list the same 2 names, ages copied and corrected and then copied again. A small smudge by the age field suggests a pause and a reconsideration that never found institutional courage. The compact adapts as attention grows. The trailer uphill shows signs of vacating. The creek cabin's chimney grows cold. Pantry shelves in the milk house stand lighter, and school books disappear. A truck that has not run in a year suddenly moves and does not return. Neighbors say nothing because this is not the kind of place that rewards saying something. The ordinary powers of a county feel theatrical against a ridge that has learned to assign itself permission. The fear is not of confrontation but of missing the moment when quiet becomes flight. A turning event arrives with less drama than the storm and more bite. The pediatric department at the regional hospital, running an audit after a statewide review of missed referrals, flags the genetics recommendation that vanished years ago. A tracking letter posts to the main house, and because the generator has not worked since the rain, a caseworker drives the ridge with a paper copy rather than relying on phones that do not ring. The timing is poor for the compact and good for the children. A welfare check with a clinical purpose holds more authority than a routine visit with a box checked, and the caseworker has a copy of the judge's narrow order. The paper trail, now a braid rather than independent strings, binds. The confrontation is less a spectacle than accumulation. Water unveiled the ledgers. A slope revealed stones that count more than they confess. A reporter's too broad request shook loose a memo whose author used careful words. An archivist's curiosity unlocked a basement box that county politics would have kept in darkness. A pediatric audit tethered, past recommendations to present duties. Between each element runs the same question posed months ago on a fogged morning. How did a son sleep with his own mother and father children, with her without alarms, sounding in the systems built to protect the vulnerable? The difference now is that multiple systems are looking at the same stack of paper, and looking together often forces movement. As winter bends toward the first hint of thaw, the ridge holds its breath. The cinder block house still stands, its windows wrapped in plastic that rattles at night. The milk house door shows new scrapes as if someone dragged crates out in a hurry. The stones at the slope remain, their grid now flagged for a lawful archaeological transect when the ground dries. The ledger pages dry flat under cheesecloth in the library's back room, weighted with atlases. The children's file moves from one desk to another with fewer pauses. The investigation that began as a librarian's errand expands into a corridor of agencies that rarely share a hallway, let alone a table. Each brings a portion of authority and a portion of reluctance. Each also brings a duty that becomes harder to ignore when the pattern is this visible. The compact will not unwind itself without a lever, and levers require fulcrums. The storm built one, the paper built another. The next act will test whether either can lift what the ridge set down over years. The intervention begins without sirens. A caseworker arrives with a pediatric nurse and a deputy who knows the switchbacks. The paper braid assembled over the winter, a judge's narrow order, the clinic memo, the audit flag, travels in a weatherproof folder. The generator is silent. The plastic over the windows lifts and falls in small sighs, as if the house were deciding whether to breathe. The nurse sets a clipboard on the stove and lays out a blood pressure cuff, a pulse oximeter, a height rod. The caseworker reads from a checklist and moves room to room, counting toothbrushes, glancing at pantry shelves, noting the path to the door. The deputy takes photographs of serial numbers on the ledger's oilcloth box and of the milk house door with its scraped paint. The children leave with the caseworker in the back seat, wrapped in blankets that do not belong to the ridge. The house yields inventory before it yields meaning. A county crew lays tarps in the yard, and an evidence technician, on loan from a city downriver, labels the ledger, the wedding photo, and the misfiled birth certificates already in the file. A paper bag is filled with school books stamped with a district mark that should not be here. A second bag takes in a manila envelope of photocopied forms with identical parental names and signatures that wobble in the same way as if written by a hand unsure how to divide itself. The milk house holds lamp oil, jars, a rolled mattress, and a stack of worn workbooks. Each item receives a tag. Each tag becomes a box on a chain of custody form that will eventually sit under fluorescent light in a courthouse room. At the slope, where stones stood in a neat grid, the ground stays closed for now. A state archaeologist, reached by phone the previous night, asks for a pause until a lawful transect can be run. The deputy strings tape in a rectangle. The house, the milk shed, the slope across the creek, the trailer uphill. 4 points around a compact that kept its own seasons. They remain quiet under a sky the color of cooled iron, while people from town carry clipboards and cases onto ground that resisted both for years. Legal movement follows the logistics. A grand jury hears a composite. Incest under state statute. Child endangerment via failure to seek mandated assessments. Falsification of vital records, and a count of obstruction tied to the clinic closure that stranded forms between basements. The mother appears as a defendant and as a probable victim in the same file. The son appears as both father and child in different paragraphs. Mixed outcomes emerge over weeks of procedural time that force the ridge to match the tempo of town. The son takes a plea to the incest count and to a document charge. A term of years is set, neither brief nor especially long, with supervision to follow. The mother's charge resolves into a suspended sentence with conditions: treatment, housing under oversight, separation orders. Both lose custodial rights. Neither is reduced to a headline. The court sets a guardian ad litem for the children. Medicine moves with more clarity than law. At the regional hospital, the children pass through triage into exams that leave no marks. Heights and weights are recorded in ink that will not run. A geneticist, borrowed for a day each month across the region, collects histories that are careful and incomplete. Samples are taken and coded, destined for labs with machines that do not know hollows, or churches, or ledgers with sigils. The older child carries speech delays and a reading lag that sits inside a bell curve. The younger reads as smaller than age would predict, and startles at the sound of carts on the linoleum. Screens suggest needs and possibilities rather than verdicts. The nurse writes a short plan in plain language: regular school, specialized support, routine. The caseworker translates this into bus routes and appointment times. Survival begins with calendar squares that hold. Placement requires a map as deliberate as the genealogy that preceded it. An aunt by marriage who lives out of county meets the criteria and takes the older child first. A foster home within reach of services takes the younger with a plan to move siblings together when housing expands. New schools acquire files. A reading specialist at a consolidation school marks progress by weeks. Letter sounds accruing, fingers tracing lines under words, a frown that loosens when an answer lands. The younger stumbles under noise, and then steadies with routines that predict the day. What had been hidden inside the ridge begins to become ordinary in a way that does not erase what came before. The house does not empty so much as dim. The trailer uphill grows bare. The cabin across the creek stands with a door unlatched. Neighbors pass by without interest, as people do when curiosity can be misread as betrayal. The ledger, dried and flattened under atlases, becomes a scan in a state system that had not planned to hold anything like it. The reel-to-reel tapes, inventoried under the judge's order, sit waiting for a machine that still works. Their labels, seasons, weeks, echo the ledger's calendar. Whether they will say anything beyond their existence is a later question. The immediate fact is that boxes no longer sit in basements without a record of their contents. Policy hardens from the soft material of lessons. The Attorney General's office drafts a consent decree with the county that names the problem without naming the family. A failure of cross-flagging when identical parental names appear on a birth record. A failure of follow-through when a genetics referral pings and then goes quiet. A failure of reach when travel distances exceed budgets. The decree carries a name that will travel beyond one ridge: the Weathers Rule, after the librarian who kept the pattern coherent when agencies could not. It forces the Vital Records Office to add an automatic halt when the same two names occupy both parent fields, requiring supervisor review within 7 days. It instructs clinics to send duplicate referrals by mail and by hand when phone service is unreliable, and to log receipt in a shared registry. It funds a small travel pool for caseworkers and nurses to reach hollows that do not pay attention to gas prices in town. It sponsors a rural registrar who spends 2 days each month in churches and community spaces, untangling paperwork before it becomes secrecy. Results are not dramatic, but they are measurable. Within 3 years, cases flagged for duplicate parental names increased detection by roughly 1/3 across the region. triage completion for rural referrals climbs from just over half to nearly 9 in 10, when travel stipends and hand-delivered letters are counted as part of the process rather than as favors. Homeschool filings that once lived in desk drawers begin to appear in a county-wide database, scanned and legible. The work is dull, which is the point. Dull work done consistently narrows the apertures where arrangements like the ridge compact settle in. The slope's grid receives the careful attention it deserves. When spring dries the ground, a small team runs a formal transect. Soil is sifted, small stones brushed, and a notebook receives entries in a neat hand that never once speculates where it cannot conclude. What emerges are shallow infant burials from winters more than a decade old, each wrapped in fabric that never had a chance to travel to a store. No signs of violence are evident. The conclusions lean toward the tragedies common to poverty and cold, county council petitions for reinterment. The remains travel to a county cemetery where a small communal marker simply notes the seasons that claimed them. No names are carved. The slope itself becomes part of a modest land trust stitched together from parcels with contested taxes. The trust is not a park and not a monument. It is a decision that nothing further will be built here, and that a creek will be allowed to take the turns it chooses. Rehabilitation proceeds at human speed. The older child settles with the aunt by marriage, moves through a reading program that requires patience rather than brilliance, and enters a vocational track that values consistent hands and a tolerance for repetition. The younger struggles through 2 placements before a long-term home holds, the kind with a refrigerator chart for chores and a dog that sleeps near the bed. Both carry a history that appears in forms and disappears in daily life. Milestones arrive without ceremony, a first library card signed in cramped letters, a certificate from a school shop, a routine doctor's visit where no specialty is required. The adults carry outcomes with more weight and more ambiguity. The son serves his term, earns a credential that helps him read warning labels on chemical drums, and joins a work crew that starts before dawn in a county that is not the one that raised him. Supervision follows him in ways both justified and blunt. The mother moves into a supervised apartment attached to a program that knows trauma is both a word and a set of practical constraints. She tends a patch of ground beside a parking lot and writes names in a notebook that she no longer needs to show anyone. Separation orders stand. Neither adult returns to the ridge while the decree is in force. The investigator who began this as an errand learns a different job without changing titles. The librarian spends mornings with genealogy patrons and afternoons training clerks to scan, index, and cross-check forms that will go stale if left in boxes. She teaches a class in the basement on reading cursive in old registers and on recognizing when a pattern is a record of harm rather than a quirk of local spelling. Her name sits in the decree's title, an honor that feels out of scale to her duties, but that carries weight when other counties ask for the template. Years later, on a late autumn afternoon when the light slants through Laurel the way it did on the day of the welfare check, the site looks more like a story being reclaimed by plants than like a crime scene. The cinder block house stands with the roof sagging in the middle. Plastic sheeting crackles along one window. The milk house door hangs crooked, its hinges orange with rust. The slope's tape is gone, replaced by ferns and the careful absence of markers. A mailbox at the bottom of the switchback is blank. The satellite dish, still pointed at nothing, leans on a post, like a shoulder that finally gave up. The creek sounds louder because there are fewer human sounds to compete. The records say more than the land now does. The ledger lives in a climate-controlled drawer at the State Archive with a digital copy available to researchers who sign a form agreeing not to publish names. The clinic memo rests in a case file marked "Closed" with conditions met. The Weathers rule sits in a binder of consent decrees that sometimes travel to conferences with titles that do not mention hollows or milk houses or stones. The children's files are sealed. The deputies' photographs live on a server with a retention policy. The librarian's notebook, worn at the corners, rests on a shelf in a second-floor office where someone else will sit when she retires. The ridge did not change its angles. The laurel still holds fog. Winters still make roads uncertain. Secrecy still has advantages here. But when a birth record lists the same names in both the parental fields, a machine now objects. When a referral goes unanswered, a calendar now nags. When a house sits beyond maps, a travel fund now makes the trip practical rather than heroic. None of this fixes history. All of it makes repetition harder. What the landscape keeps are the sounds and the distances and the habits that made the ridge compact possible. What the records now say is that habits can be named and met with other habits, scanning, flagging, visiting, that are not dramatic enough to make stories but are sturdy enough to hold lives. The question posed at the beginning remains useful as a guardrail rather than as a wound. How did this happen, and how will it not happen again? Here or in any other hollow that teaches offices to say no by shortening their days and lengthening their roads.